It was a bitterly cold December night in 1994 when Sarah Mitchell first walked into that crumbling Victorian house on Ashwood Lane. The house, draped in shadow, was the kind that seemed to exhale secrets, its broken windows watching the world like hollow, accusing eyes. Sarah, young and full of dreams, had inherited it from an estranged great-aunt she barely remembered. Most people would have sold it, moved on without a second thought. But not Sarah. She was determined to make it her home. Her three closest friends, Henry, Emily, and Rachel, joined her on that fateful evening to celebrate her new beginning. The four of them were inseparable, bound by years of friendship and shared adventures. They laughed as they unloaded boxes, teasing Sarah about her peculiar taste in real estate. But as night fell and the moon cast long, jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper, their laughter grew quieter, more tentative. The house seemed to absorb their joy, leaving behind an eerie stillness. It started with small things easy to dismiss. A door creaked open when no one was near. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hall when everyone was accounted for. Emily joked that the house had character, but Rachel's smile never quite reached her eyes. "Do you ever feel like we're being watched?" Rachel asked as they gathered in the dimly lit kitchen. The others laughed nervously, but no one answered. The real unease began 2 nights later when Sarah decided to stay in the house alone. She was determined to prove to herself, and to her friends, that there was nothing to fear. Armed with her grandmother's old oil lamp and a journal, she settled into the living room, trying to shake the creeping sense of dread that clung to her like a second skin. By midnight, the house had grown impossibly silent. The kind of silence that isn't just an absence of sound but a presence all its own. Sarah had almost convinced herself that she was imagining things when she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It came from the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. "Sarah!" Her heart leapt into her throat. The voice was faint but unmistakable. Trembling, she turned toward the sound. There was nothing there. Just shadows. Just her imagination. That's what she told herself as she bolted upstairs to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. The next morning, she called Henry, Emily, and Rachel, insisting they come over. She needed their company, and their reassurance. When they arrived, she told them what had happened. Henry, always the skeptic, laughed it off. "Old houses make noises. It's probably just the wind," he said. But Emily and Rachel weren't so sure. "You said it whispered your name?" Emily asked, her brow furrowed. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. It wasn't the wind. It sounded real. Despite Henry's protests, they agreed to spend the night, determined to prove, or disprove, Sarah's claims. By midnight, the house seemed to come alive. Doors creaked open and slammed shut without warning. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls, growing louder and more insistent. And then came the whispers. Not just one voice, but many, overlapping and dissonant, calling Sarah's name. They gathered in the living room, huddled together, their faces pale. Rachel was the first to speak. "There's something wrong with this house," she whispered. "We need to leave." But Sarah refused. "This is my home. I'm not running away." Henry, ever the rational one, decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into the basement, insisting that the source of the noises had to be somewhere down there. The others waited anxiously at the top of the stairs, their breaths held. He was gone for what felt like hours. When he finally reappeared, his face was ashen, his hands shaking. "There's something down there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it is, but it's wrong." The whispers grew louder that night, until they weren't whispers at all but shouts, screams that seemed to come from every corner of the house. They called Sarah's name over and over, demanding, pleading, threatening. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The four of them sat in silence, too terrified to speak. That's when they noticed the scratches. Deep, jagged marks gouged into the walls, forming words that hadn't been there before. "Leave now." Rachel was the first to break. "I can't do this," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, you have to leave. This house isn't safe." But Sarah refused. Something about the house called to her, held her in its grip. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't leave. The following weeks were a blur of terror. Sarah's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She stopped sleeping, her eyes shadowed and haunted. She spoke to things no one else could see, her voice low and strange. Her friends watched helplessly as she descended into madness. It was Emily who finally convinced the group to call for help. They brought in a local historian, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, who had spent decades studying the dark history of Ashwood Lane. "This house," he said, his voice trembling, "was built on cursed ground. There have been incidents. Deaths. The Mitchell family has always been connected to it. I'm afraid Sarah is the latest victim." He told them about the house's original owner, a man named Elias Blackwood, who had dabbled in dark rituals. Legend had it that he had summoned something that had never left. "You need to leave," he said. "All of you. This house cannot be saved." But it was too late. Sarah was no longer Sarah. Her friends watched in horror as she changed before their eyes. Her voice, her movements, even her eyes, everything about her was wrong. The whispers now came from her lips, her laughter echoing with something dark and inhuman. They tried to reach her, to bring her back. But whatever had taken hold of her was too strong. And then, one night, she disappeared. They searched the house, the surrounding woods, even the nearby town, but there was no trace of her. It was as if she had been swallowed whole. The house remains empty to this day, its windows dark and accusing, its hall silent but for the faintest echo of a young woman's laughter. Locals say they sometimes see her in the upstairs window, her shadow flickering like a flame. As for Henry, Emily, and Rachel, they never spoke of what happened that winter. But their friendship was shattered, their lives forever marked by the house on Ashwood Lane. And Sarah Mitchell? She became a story. A cautionary tale whispered around campfires, told to scare children into obedience. But for those who know the truth, it's more than a story. It's a warning. If you ever find yourself walking down Ashwood Lane, and you hear someone whisper your name, don't answer. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't go inside. Do you want to hear more stories like this? Hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover the darkest, most chilling tales from around the world. Because sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that are true.